Thank you very much for your welcome. It's a pleasure to be here in Berlin, I suggested speaking to this topic not out of any sense of provincialism, but precisely for the opposite reason, and that is that because French-German reconciliation is widely seen as having been rapid, deep, with substantial geopolitical implications, there has also been a widespread sense that maybe this is something which can be or should be imitated. There certainly was a very strong sense of that, and I'll come back to that in a second, in the erstwhile Warsaw Pact countries shortly after the fall of the wall here in Berlin. You know, how can we do the same thing, and how can we produce the same results? And what I'm going to argue is that French-German cooperation has a number of conditions which do not make it readily replicable outside of the European context. This is, I would add, I consider that this is not particularly good news because since this, reconciliation is seen as having been successful for at least half a century, it would be nice to know that similar things could be done, let's say, between China and Japan, or between Japan and Korea, to take two particularly fraught and important bilateral relationships. And when I say bilateral, not only between state and state, but between society and society. First, a very quick word about the pace of French-German cooperation. It began immediately after the Second World War, and I'll come back to that in a second. Within 5 years of the end of the Cold War, that's a remarkably short space of time, you already had on the table the first treaty of European cooperation, the Schuman Plan. You had another treaty on European defense cooperation, which posited the rearmament of Germany, not a minor affair, and one which could certainly not have been contemplated if the French had not been a driving force at the time of moving in that direction. Treaty was not ratified, but that's another story. The broader point is that within years of the end of the Second World War, one had moved from the deepest of antagonisms to a cooperative relationship. And furthermore, this relationship was politically and geopolitically bankable. That is, what happened subsequently, during the subsequent 50 years, was that the pace, the content, and the form of the European integration process was a dependent variable of French-German cooperation, at least until reunification. How did this come about? And here we get into the conditions. Well, at the creation, Stunde Null, hour zero, as they say here in Germany in 1945, you had, first of all, you had a clear-cut military outcome. That is, Germany's defeat was complete and unquestionable from whatever perspective the situation was considered. It was understood to be such by all and sundry, by victors and vanquished. Secondly, there was in the West, and notably between France and Germany, an unquestioned territorial conclusion to the conflict. There were no loose strings hanging as to where the fence between the two neighbors was going to run. The political fence, of course, not the physical fence. No walls. Thirdly, there was a deep and shared feeling that the costs of yet another round of mutual bloodletting would be wholly unacceptable to the peoples and the countries of concerned. That led to a situation, these conditions led to a situation where the risk of territorial revisionism and political and military revanchism, were eliminated. Fundamental. We sometimes tend to forget that. There is another element here also, which is sometimes forgotten, but which is actually quite powerful. There was a symmetry between the historical experience of the two partners. The two partners had both been in the putative hegemon league in their history. That's not a good thing in itself, but it does mean that there was no basic inferiority or indeed superiority conflict in any one of the two partners vis-à-vis the other. And I'll come back to that also in a few seconds when we talk about other examples. That's 1945, the conditions of departure. What's very interesting is that the initial impetus for reconciliation came from society, did not come from the state. There was no German state. And there were not even two German states, there was simply Zilch. In France, didn't come from the state. It was too early for that. It came as an idea from the intellectual and cultural milieu. And in particular, this one is always highlighted in the French literature, and rightly so, I would add. There was an article in one of the French literary journals in October 45. Think of the date, October 45, by Joseph Rovan. Joseph Rovan, who died a few years ago, was an Austrian Jew who his family emigrated to France in the 20s and who spent a few years in Dachau, in the concentration camp. He comes out of concentration camp not in the best of health, in the late spring of 1945. And what is his first intellectual endeavor? Is to write a piece which is called, there are such things as seminal ideas and seminal pieces. It was called L'Allemagne de nos mérites. We will have the Germany we deserve. Let's not repeat 1918, the subliminal message. And this was taken to heart. So when things began to enter into the governmental sphere in the late 40s, with a government being set up in the Federal Republic of Germany, in the French government, people who were willing to contemplate cooperation with the new Germany, you had an idea laid there, you had cultural and you had intellectual roots to the process. And without those roots, it is doubtful whether French-German cooperation would have become the permanent and structuring element of the Western European space that it was for the following 50 years. And let me explain very briefly why. Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer, and this was, of course, already a number of years after the initial stages of the process, in effect decided on a compact. It was de facto, it was not laid down in law, it wasn't even presented as such, but it functioned as a compact. And that was, whatever the differences between France and Germany on the future shape of Europe, and the differences, by the way, are extraordinarily deep, because de Gaulle wanted l'Europe des patries, the Europe of the nations, and Adenauer wanted a fully federal Europe. Whatever those differences are, we will agree on what is going to be done next. And because those differences are so deep and so wide, because they are greater than the differences between all other members of the European community, this agreement will shape the European community, the European integration process. Passing such a contract such a compact, would not have been possible if there hadn't been those intellectual roots. It would otherwise have looked much more like the bilateral relations, the good bilateral relations, which have existed between all sorts of European countries between each other in Western Europe in the post-World War II era. There would have been moments of agreement, moments of disagreement. It would not have been a permanent and structuring relationship. So that's what it was. The idea at the beginning, and then the geostrategic and geoeconomic substance in which to make this idea occupy political space. Yes, of course, the French-German relationship would not have produced the effects it produced if we hadn't had the Cold War, if we hadn't had the threat of World War III, if we hadn't had the impetus of rebuilding materially and intellectually Western Europe after the horrors and destruction of the Second World War. But once again, at the beginning, you needed the idea. At the beginning was the word. Now, how replicable are these conditions, these ideas? Well, the short answer is not very much. And let me just take two examples, two important examples. One where you have had and where you continue to have and where you will continue to have something resembling the French-German reconciliation process. I'll explain why. And that is what has been happening ever since the fall of the Soviet Empire in the early 90s, and that is reconciliation in Central and presumably in Southeastern Europe, and potentially between Central Europe and Russia. Let me take Central Europe first. We've had the Weimar Triangle between Poland, Germany, and France. That was helpful. We've had, notwithstanding bumps on the road, a very significant, very serious reconciliation, bilateral reconciliation between Germany and Poland. But this could only happen once a number of things had occurred. The most basic one, in the case of Germany and Poland, being, of course, the acceptance, the full unquestioning acceptance of the territorial status quo. And this happened during what you call here in Germany die Wende, during the change of 1990, 1991. That is when the Oder-Neisse line ceased to be referred to as the Oder-Neisse line. Simply have a normal border between Germany and Poland. That was a basic precondition. You also had a new element, which was a spin-off of French-German reconciliation, and that is the countries of Central Europe, and not only Poland, of course, fully understood, immediately understood. It was actually very impressive when I would be traveling in the winter of 1989-90 to Romania, to Hungary, to Poland, to what was still then Czechoslovakia. It was immediately understood that there was no hope, no prospect of entering the European integration process if there was not the functional equivalent of French-German reconciliation. It was an extraordinarily powerful lever. Remember the pogroms against the Hungarians in Transylvania in the winter of 89-90. It stopped immediately. Because if it went on, neither Hungary nor Romania were going to make it into the European Union. French-German reconciliation and the broader emulation, acceptance, integration of this process into the broader Western European space has made the non-use of force, has made reconciliation, has made cooperation one of the key elements of the European Union's DNA. So either you acquire the DNA and you get into the Union, or you don't acquire the DNA, you don't get into the Union. And this is what is also now at stake in the Balkans. I'm reasonably confident. I go to Serbia quite often, Kosovo also from time to time. It's very difficult. It's going to take time. There's been a lot of bloodshed. There have been wars, recent wars. But it will happen. It will happen. Why? Because of the pulling power of the European Union. But that's also another way of saying, well, yeah, it's happening because of the specific circumstances of the European Union and because of what the DNA of the European Union is. And that is not widely replicable. Russia, Central Europe. Russia is not going to enter the European Union. I don't think it has a wish to do so, and I don't think there'd be a consensus in the European Union either. I don't think that is in the realm of realistic propositions. But the interface between the European Union and Russia is a tremendously important one in economic, political, strategic sense. There is a growing understanding in Russia that that interface is not going to be stable. It is not going to be conducive to the sort of openness in terms of travels of people, flow of capital, flow of technology, which will be necessary for the modernization of Russia. Big debates going on in Russia as we speak on this theme, but debates which are crystallizing into quite remarkable processes. Look at Russia, Poland. And here you see one of the other things at play. You know, I said early on the idea and then the interests. The idea of reconciliation and the interests of whatever geostrategic and geoeconomic, geopolitical issues were at stake. Idea accompanied with symbolic and emotional content. I will always remember when I was living in London and my British friends couldn't understand what was so special about the French-German relationship, because they were saying, well, after all, it's all about symbols. And I said, well, I'm sorry, guys, yes, you're absolutely right. It is all about symbols. But that's why it's so, that is why it works, and that is why and the symbols are of the essence. So what happened between Poland and Russia, the closing of accounts, the Vergangenheitsüberbewältigung about Katyn, not a minor thing, admitting that you, Russia, have shot in cold blood 20,000 Polish officers who are under your protection. Do that. And then you have a tragedy, and you run the corresponding film made by Andrzej Wajda on primetime state television. In this media era, symbolism was incredibly powerful. So at the beginning of the Russian-Polish process, the new Russian-Polish process, you have a symbol. Very powerful. And so my hopes are fairly high on that score. But when I moved to Asia, unfortunately, I don't have similar confidence to impart. I've had a little bit of involvement in some of the debates between the Chinese and Japanese historians on reconciliation. Some do attempt deliberately to look at what has happened between France and Germany, Poland and Germany, and so on, and see whether there are ways here to do something similar between China and Japan. Well, the conditions are simply too different. The territorial status quo is not accepted. Look at President Medvedev's visit to the Kuril Islands. Look at the naval incident between China and Japan the other day. There is no territorial stability. There is no common sense that war is unacceptable. In Japan, yes. Japan has had more than its fill, and I think that will continue to prevail for a long time. But in the Korean Peninsula, in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, in China, we have seen plenty of conflict over the last few decades. So that element is also lacking. And as for the geoeconomic and geostrategic dimensions, which have brought high degrees of interdependence between countries, between Japan and the countries which had been brutalized by Japan during the Second World War. All of the countries of East and Southeast Asia, I would add. It's a lot of people, more actually than Germany did in Europe. That interdependence does not have under it the foundation of a common idea. And therefore, and in the lack of any form of leverage of the sort which exists within the EU DNA, the chances of arriving at a similar conclusion in East Asia are, in my view, fairly limited. This is not simply an academic exercise. It also means that when we think about the future of the world, in which we have an immensely powerful China rising, acquiring superpower status, etc., this will be done on the basis of unreconciled differences in what is now strategically and economically the most important part of the world. So I started with a very parochial item, what the people on either side of the Rhine think about each other, and I've ended with a global consideration. I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so let's go ahead.
Thanks for a fascinating tour d'horizon of the German-French relations. Does it work now?
I hear you.
I'll just speak up. I can say from my own family, my father was made in school when you learned French to learn a historic lie. Les Français ont déclaré la guerre aux Allemands. So I can see in my own family how progress has been made. He was made to learn the French declared war on the Germans. So the historic lie. And we had school exchanges with France. What I would like to know is, what do you think was the key leading up to those ideas that you described? How was it possible within 1 or 2 generations for someone to learn that stuff in school, for the grandchild then to be on school exchange with the Reims? There must be something, especially since you mentioned that people lost next of kin in the wars. What was the key?
Well, it's one of the items which I mentioned. It is this sense that we simply can't afford to do this again. And that's not a positive argument. It is a powerfully negative argument in the sense that we can't do again, we must not do again what we have done. 1870-71, 1914, 1918, 1939, 1945, and I forget all of the previous episodes, which gave their names to various parts of Berlin, like Pariser Platz and Französer Straße, etc. So there was this sense that history was not worth repeating. As I say, this is not a positive foundation, but it is a very solid foundation. The positive part of the foundation, well, it is the victims speaking up. And this is why I emphasized Rovan, because, well, and here it's a little bit of a reflection about the role of individuals in history. Rovan, like Robert Schumann, was in effect a man of 2 universes. The German universe, French universe, Latin universe, Germanic universe, able to communicate on both sides. Because, of course, most of Rovan's activity was actually not in France. Most of it was in Germany. When Rovan turned, 80, Chancellor Kohl came to Paris. This was in 1992 or 93. Chancellor Kohl came to Paris on purpose, just to cut the birthday cake with Rovan at the German embassy. Why? Because Kohl, who was a historian by training, who is a Rhineland person, man of also 2 universes. I have a conflict of interest here. I'm also a Rhineland person, and half of me comes from Luxembourg. Kohl understood very well what was the role of ideas and individuals ab initio. And those ideas played a role in our ministries, Ministry of Education, for example. And that, by the way, continues. I don't know whether you've seen the joint French-German history textbooks, the 2 volumes which have come out for the schools here in Germany and France, secondary level schools. They're bloody good, which is which is surprising, because when you have committees, particularly multinational committees who work on contentious subjects, you tend to winnow out everything that's interesting and you only keep in what is bland and consensual. They're A, they're very interesting, and B, they're very useful. They're real. There is a real sense of common narrative. Yeah, that's quite, when there'll be a common narrative between Chinese and Japanese, or Korean and Japanese history textbooks, wow, that will be a really big change. So you're absolutely right. The schooling aspect, training aspect, was fundamental. That's the positive aspect, as opposed to the negative, never again type of thing.
Thank you very much. Just wondering if you would maybe amplify a few of these points, in particular this notion of the unaffordability of future conflict. You mentioned Schumann, but not the words coal and steel. Sure. And I'm sure that, that the resource richness plays an important role in convincing the two parties that there is a better future ahead with some common purpose. Also, in the same vein, in thinking about sort of material levers, nothing about the Marshall Plan, and I'm just wondering what role you think, if any, it played.
Let me start with the Marshall Plan. The role played was actually fundamental. Not in terms of creating the atmosphere, because once again the ideas had been sown, but in creating the instrumentalities, the levers, and the fulcrums on which you put the levers. The beauty of the Marshall Plan was not the money. The Americans were giving just as much money in 45, 46, and 47 to Europe as they were giving in 48, 49, 50, just about the same. But the money was subordinated to the establishment of European-wide, Western European-wide, a process of allocation, which, for example, institutional anecdotes are useful in this respect. The French body which frames European integration policy today, today it's called the Secrétariat Général à la Coopération Européenne, interagency body. Nothing very remarkable about it, except that until 10 years ago, 2000, it was called the Secrétariat Général à la Coordination Interministérielle, which nothing European about it. And when was this SGCI created? It was created in 1948 in order to coordinate the French presence in the European handling of the Marshall Plan. As I say, institutional anecdote, but in these matters, the institutions, in combination with very substantial amounts of money, played an absolutely major role. I didn't mention coal and steel for reasons of brevity, not because of lack of importance. I covered that under the word geoeconomic. I don't usually like the word geoeconomic, but in this case, it did apply because it was seen as a geoeconomic affair to bring together the coal and steel interests of the Ruhr, of the Saarland, of Luxembourg, of Lorraine, of northern France, and of the Belgium coal basin. If these sources of conflict and division pre-1914 could be brought together as a single integrated economic unit in the field of coal and steel, which in those days were the equivalent of what the internet and information technology are, and the knowledge economy are to the world today, then you would eliminate a potential source of war. And yes, this was fundamental. But it would not have happened if you hadn't had the idea of reconciliation upstream. I always come back to that point. At the beginning, you really do have to have the word. Yep.
What recommendations would you make then for reconciliation between China and Japan?
Try hard. I mean that. I mean, I say it in a joking manner, but you have to try hard. You have to be you have to create consciousness between the historians and the politicians of what is at stake. Historians have not always played a positive role in our histories. The historians of the pre-1914 school were a very major element in building up the narratives which enabled the war of 1914-1918. Historians are not necessarily on the side of the good guys. But there are in China, as in Japan, plenty of historians who understand that. So I think they're essentially a force for good. What is important is that they be able to connect with the politicians, to make it clearly understood that if you don't have some degree of reconciliation between the peoples, that when you start getting into strategically extraordinarily contentious situations, and there's plenty of scope for that as the American commitment in East Asia is destined to weak, as Japan's strategic isolation grows, and as China's power massively increases, that the conjunction of these three things may well lead to substantial strategic instability in a 20 or 30-year perspective in East Asia. And to have unreconciled differences between Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, under those circumstances is going to make it a whole lot more difficult to avoid the potential for conflict flowing from those kinds of instabilities. Even if nobody wants war. I mean, I don't think anybody wants war in East Asia today. I think everybody would say this would be sheer lunacy, and indeed it would. But wars don't happen because people necessarily want them.
We have time for one more question.
Please.
While listening to you, I was thinking of Obama's visit today to India, which has as its explicit purpose, according to US media, to help, to promote India as a rival to China in order not to let China get too strong. So, and the European Union has a similar policy. So, what about us remembering the idea that led to French-German cooperation? Should we not work towards greater unity rather than division in Asia?
I haven't seen Obama's speech, I haven't read it, so I won't comment. Obviously, I won't comment on his speech. But the basic notion that it is a smart idea to try to build up the relationship with India as a counterpoise, a counterfoil to the rise of China, it's not a good way of proceeding. And this for two reasons. One, the most obvious one, which is, I think, the one which lies behind your question, and that is, you know, if you promote a balance of forces, a type of approach, you run the risk of feeding conflict. But there's another reason why it's not a good idea. India is, in strategic terms, an entirely free agent. India, as a great power, is a free agent. It is not going to allow itself to be manipulated in a balance of power type of game. The paradox, and I hardly ever say anything good about George W. Bush's foreign and security policies. The paradox is that the Bushies, I think, understood this in some ways better than either the Clintonites or the Obama people. One Indian analyst called Bush's policy, the success of Bush's policy, he attributed it to the de-hyphenization of America's approach to the subcontinent. What does that mean? That sounds very bizarre. It is bizarre, actually. That is, to cease viewing the relationship with India as a companion to how you consider relations with Pakistan, how you consider relations with China. That you have to have a holistic approach and not one which is built on the interrelationship of actual India-Pakistan or potential China-India conflicts. I find it actually quite strange that the Obama people have not taken on board some of the elements of the Bush approach towards the subcontinent. I say some elements, not all of them. I'm a strong antagonist of the nuclear deal with India. That was 3 bridges too far, if I can put it that way. But otherwise, viewing the subcontinent as a whole, which is what Bush tried to do, was a more serious approach than the one which we have seen with Clinton, and which appears also to be that of the State Department under Obama.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, Professor Heisbourg.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.